The wild can turn deadly in moments. From a grizzly killing 7 hunters in minutes to a moose charging men in Newfoundland, from a bear crashing through a cabin roof in Alaska to a raging boar in Germany, from a Kodiak dragging a hunter from his tent to a starving polar bear striking on thin ice in Nunavut, these encounters show nature's brutal power. Watch till the end. These 6 true stories will leave you shaken. August 26, 2025, began with a gray sky over the Ussuri Taiga, a vast wilderness near the Beacon River in the Russian Far East. The land was dense with alder, birch, and pine, and its rivers swelled with salmon returning to spawn. This seasonal migration brought not only fishermen and hunters but also massive grizzlies, each drawn by the promise of an easy meal. Among them was a notorious bear, a beast that weighed close to 900 pounds and had already raided nearby villages, scattering livestock and destroying stores of food. For locals, this bear had become a threat too large to ignore. 7 hunters from Khabarovsk set out with hopes of ending the menace before it reached another settlement. They carried Mosin Nagant rifles and SKS carbines, each chambered in the powerful 7.62x54R cartridge. These weapons had served soldiers and hunters for generations, built for endurance in rough terrain. The men were seasoned outdoorsmen, used to long days in the taiga, where patience and silence meant survival. Their plan was simple: find the bear near the river, intercept it at dawn, and bring it down before it could vanish back into the thick forest. Among the group was Sergei Antonov, the eldest at 50, who had led hunting trips for decades. He was respected for his calm judgment and knowledge of the land. Younger men looked to him for guidance as they crossed through damp undergrowth and listened to the rush of the Beacon River. Alongside him was Pavel Smirnov, 32, a farmer who had lost livestock to the bear weeks earlier. His motivation was personal, and his determination was fierce. The others, men of similar age and background, shared a bond of duty to their communities. As the hunters moved through the thickets, they followed salmon trails along the riverbank, their boots pressed into soft mud, their eyes scanned for signs of movement, and the early light filtered weakly through clouds. They set up positions near a stretch where fish gathered, believing the bear would appear there. Calm moments stretched as they waited in silence, their breaths visible in the cool air. Without warning, the peace was shattered. From alder thickets less than 30 meters away, the enormous grizzly burst forward. Its fur bristled and its bulk crashed through brush with terrifying speed. The hunters raised their rifles, the air filling with the sharp crack of gunfire. Bullets struck, but the adrenaline-fueled charge did not slow. The beast lunged directly into the line, its jaws snapping and claws slashing with violent force. Within moments, screams rose above the shots. Men were knocked down, bodies slammed against the earth as the predator tore through the formation. In under 2 minutes, the quiet riverbank had become a scene of chaos. Blood mixed with the churned soil, and weapons fell silent beneath the roar of the animal. The great predator tore through the line with unstoppable force. Sergei fell first, crushed beneath the animal's weight as claws raked across his chest. Pavel fired again and again, but the massive shape barreled into him, throwing him against a tree before striking with its jaws. The others tried to reload, but the short distance and sudden charge left them no time. Screams echoed through the thickets as bodies were dragged down, their weapons scattered uselessly across the ground. In less than 2 minutes, the clearing became a place of ruin. 6 men cut down under the power of tooth and claw. Downstream, one hunter had stepped away moments earlier to relieve himself. His rifle leaned against a birch tree, out of reach when the noise of gunfire and cries shattered the morning stillness. He froze, heart pounding as he realized what had erupted above the river. Grabbing the only object in his hand, a flare pistol meant for signaling passing barges, he stumbled back toward the noise. Through the mist, he saw the beast, blood streaking its fur as it loomed over the fallen. Desperation overtook fear. He raised the flare pistol, fired, and the burning round struck the animal's flank. A burst of fire clung to the thick fur, searing flesh and driving the predator into sudden rage. Roaring, it spun, clawing at its side before crashing back through the thickets. The sound of breaking branches and pounding steps echoed as it vanished into the shadows of the taiga, leaving behind silence broken only by the shallow breaths of the lone survivor. The scene around him was unbearable. Friends and companions lay scattered on the riverbank, rifles dropped where they had fallen. Smoke from the flare drifted above the alder leaves, mixing with the cold mist off the water. 6 men who had set out with confidence that morning now lay lifeless in the mud. Their hunt ended before it truly began. The survivor staggered toward his rifle, but his hands shook too badly to lift it. Instead, he sank to the ground, staring at the thickets where the animal had disappeared. Hours later, rangers arrived after hearing the gunfire echo through the valley. They found the survivor in shock, barely able to speak. The bodies of the fallen were recovered, and the story of the hunt spread quickly through the villages. For weeks, fear hung over the region as people wondered if the wounded beast still roamed the forests. Days later, the rangers tracked the path of the grizzly and found it dead not far from the river. Infection from the burning wound had taken its toll, ending the life of the animal that had destroyed so many in minutes. The discovery brought grim closure, but little comfort to the families of the hunters who never returned. The survivor carried the memory of that morning for the rest of his life. One flare had been the difference between death and survival. The lesson of the Ussuri taiga was clear. In land ruled by apex predators, even the strongest weapons may fail, and chance alone can decide who walks away. October 2023 began with cold winds sweeping across the boglands near Gander in Newfoundland, where rifle season had drawn experienced hunters deep into the mossy lowlands. The landscape was rugged, dotted with alders and patches of swamp where bull moose in rut moved restlessly in search of rivals and mates. For locals, autumn was not just a season of harvest, but also a reminder of the dangers hidden in the forest. Every year, guides warned newcomers that a moose in rut was unpredictable and dangerous, with aggression that could rival even the fiercest predator. Among the hunters that month was Robert Callahan, a 42-year-old carpenter from St. John's who had spent most of his life exploring Newfoundland's backcountry. Strong and practical, he hunted not only for sport but also to provide meat for his family. Alongside him was his longtime friend Daniel Fraser, 39, a school teacher who spent his free time in the woods. The 2 men had hunted together for years, sharing camps, tracking animals, and braving long days in the cold and damp terrain. Their partnership was built on trust and an unspoken rhythm of teamwork that allowed them to face the challenges of the wilderness. The boglands near Gander were alive with activity as the rut reached its peak. Bulls clashed antlers in distant clearings, their calls echoing through the forest. Tracks pressed deep into the moss showed where animals had passed, their size and weight leaving heavy imprints in the wet ground. Robert and Daniel moved carefully through the alder thickets, rifles in hand, scanning for signs of movement. The men knew that patience and caution were essential, for a bull in rut was easily provoked. Late in the morning, Robert positioned himself near a clearing while Daniel stepped a short distance away to cow call. The sound carried through the trees, soft but insistent, imitating the cry of a receptive female. Moments later, branches snapped in the distance. A massive bull appeared, ears pinned flat against its head, froth spilling from its muzzle, and antlers wide and sharp like spears. The animal lowered its head and advanced, drawn by the call but brimming with rage. At 60 yards, the bull broke into a charge, hooves tearing through moss and mud, its size filling the narrow path. Robert raised his point .30.06 and fired, the crack of the rifle ringing across the clearing. The bullet clipped the rib, but the shot was not enough to stop the momentum. The moose thundered forward, striking Robert full force. He was knocked to the ground, his body driven into the damp moss as the sharp antlers pierced his shoulder and ripped through his parka. The weight of the animal bore down like a storm, each thrust of the antlers cutting deeper. Daniel swung his rifle into place, heart racing as he saw his friend pinned beneath the beast. At close range, he fired once, then again, both rounds from the .308 slamming into the bull's chest. The massive animal staggered but pressed forward, looming over Robert with fury still burning in its dark eyes. The huge bull reeled from the impact of Daniel's shots, its legs churning the moss as it tried to push forward. Foam still dripped from its muzzle as the animal towered over Robert, its eyes fixed with blind rage. For a breathless moment it seemed unstoppable, as if even bullets could not halt the fury driving it. Daniel steadied himself and squeezed the trigger once more. The final round struck true, hitting deep into the chest at almost point-blank distance. The bull stumbled, gave a violent shudder, and collapsed beside Robert, its antlers gouging the soft earth as it hit the ground. Silence returned to the boglands except for Robert's gasps of pain. His shoulder was torn open, his parka ripped apart and soaked with blood. The force of the collision had shattered his collarbone, leaving him unable to move his arm. Daniel rushed to his side, dragging him clear of the lifeless bull. The scene around them showed the raw violence of the encounter. Moss was churned into mud, antler marks ripped across the ground, and the air was heavy with the smell of gunpowder and sweat. The long trek back to camp began immediately. Daniel supported Robert as best as he could, their steps slow and unsteady through the thickets. Each movement sent fresh waves of pain through Robert's body, but he gritted his teeth and pressed forward. When they finally reached camp, the other men quickly dressed the wounds and did what they could to ease the bleeding. Hours passed before they managed to get him to a medical post, where doctors confirmed the seriousness of his injuries. His collarbone had been shattered, and the deep tears across his shoulder required stitches to close. Recovery was slow and difficult. Robert survived, but the damage left permanent stiffness in his arm. He would never again lift his rifle with the same strength, and even simple tasks became more challenging. For a man who had built his life around hard work and outdoor skills, it was a lasting reminder of how quickly fortune could change in the wilderness. Back at home, the story spread through the community. Hunters and guides discussed the encounter in hushed tones, shaking their heads at the fury of a bull moose in rut. The image of the massive antlers driving into Robert's shoulder stayed with all who heard it. Guides reminded newcomers each autumn that moose were not gentle giants, but unpredictable animals capable of immense violence when provoked. Robert accepted his new limitations with quiet resolve. Though his arm would never fully heal, he continued to spend time in the forests, passing on what he had learned to younger hunters. He spoke often about the danger of underestimating moose, reminding others that their size and power demanded respect. Daniel, too, carried the memory of that day, knowing that his fast action had saved his friend's life. The boglands of Newfoundland returned to silence after the season ended, but the scars of that encounter remained. One man carried them in his body, another in his mind, and the wider community in their caution. Every autumn, when the bulls began their restless calls again, the story was retold as a warning. In that rugged land, the fury of a moose in rut was remembered as being as fearsome as any predator, a force of nature that no one could take lightly. August 2024 settled over the Kenai Peninsula with long days of steady rain and the sound of salmon moving through the creeks. For hunters and fishermen, it was a season filled with work and reward, but also danger, as bears followed the same rivers in search of food. Alone in this wild stretch of Alaska, 44-year-old Nathaniel Brooks had chosen to spend several weeks in an abandoned trapper's cabin. Nathaniel was not new to the land. Born and raised in Anchorage, he had spent decades balancing work as a mechanic with his passion for hunting. The cabin offered him shelter close to the stream where he hung drying racks filled with fish, a crucial supply for the winter months ahead. The structure itself was worn from years of weather with a sagging roof and patched walls, but Nathaniel trusted it to keep out the cold. The creek nearby shimmered under the northern sky, and the dense spruce forest surrounding the clearing provided both cover and constant reminder of what lived there. He kept his lever action point 45-70 close at all times, understanding that this land belonged first to the animals, and that one careless moment could turn a quiet night into a fight for survival. For several days he lived in rhythm with the land, catching salmon, preparing them, and stringing them up inside the cabin. The strong scent of drying fish filled the air, and while it gave Nathaniel satisfaction to see his stores grow, he knew it was also a lure to the grizzlies that patrolled the creeks. Each evening he double-checked the door, adjusted the shutters, and tried to ignore the distant calls echoing through the forest. On one particular night the forest seemed unusually quiet, the creek muffled under a heavy stillness. Nathaniel rested on the bunk with lantern light flickering against the wooden walls. Then came the first heavy thump. The cabin shook under the weight pressing from above. His heart quickened as another crash followed, louder, closer, sending dust from the rafters. Nathaniel realized with dread that a grizzly had climbed onto the roof. The shingles groaned and splintered as the full weight of the predator pressed down. Old beams cracked as claws scraped against the boards. Nathaniel gripped his rifle, sliding against the bunk to keep low as the sounds grew louder above his head. Then, with a deafening crash, one heavy paw broke through, ripping a jagged hole in the roof. Cold air and fragments of wood rained into the cabin. The bear forced its way downward, tearing wider gaps as it searched for the source of the fish scent. Lanterns tipped over, spilling oil and smoke that filled the cramped space. Nathaniel struggled to see through the haze, the glow flickering across the heaving roof where claws raked downward. He aimed upward and fired, the crack echoing in the cabin as the bullet struck the intruder. A sharp yelp followed, but the bear did not leave immediately. Instead, it thrashed above, sending more boards tumbling into the room as the struggle between man and beast filled the night. The rifle blast still echoed through the clearing as the bear clawed wildly against the collapsing boards. Each strike sent splinters flying, and the air inside the cabin grew thick with smoke and dust. Nathaniel pressed tighter against the bunk, rifle held close, bracing for another assault from above. The roof sagged heavily, a gaping hole exposing the night sky, while the animal's weight shifted from side to side as it tried to force its way inside. A second crashing sound shook the cabin as the bear slipped backward slightly, its claws ripping against the wood. Growls rolled through the smoke-filled air, deep and angry, vibrating through the walls. The animal pawed again, thrusting its head and shoulder into the gap, snapping at shadows, its muzzle glistening in the dim light. Nathaniel raised the weapon once more and fired upward. The shot cracked loudly, the recoil slamming against his shoulder, and the grizzly gave a violent lurch before scrambling away from the hole. The minutes that followed stretched long. The bear moved along the roof, thumping heavily, circling as if unsure whether to retreat or continue. Nathaniel kept the rifle ready, his eyes watering from the haze of oil smoke and broken lantern glass. Finally, the noise began to fade, claws scraping against the outer wall before silence returned. Outside, the night was once again filled only by the sound of the creek and the distant cry of wind moving through the trees. Cautiously, Nathaniel rose from the bunk. The cabin was wrecked. A wide section of roof lay shattered, open to the sky. Splinters littered the floor alongside broken lanterns, spilled fish, and overturned gear. Smoke curled upward through the hole, and cold air poured inside, chilling the damp room. Above the gap, faint smears of blood marked where the bear had been hit, but the animal had escaped into the forest. When dawn finally arrived, the damage was clear in the gray light. The roof sagged badly, lanterns were shattered, and nearly all of the stored fish had been torn apart or ruined by the smoke. Nathaniel stepped outside and found deep claw marks scored into the cabin walls, scars that showed just how much force had struck during the night. Prints in the mud led back toward the tree line, each wide impression proof of the size of the predator. Word of the event spread quickly through the nearby settlements. Locals who heard the story nodded knowingly, for in Alaska, bears raiding cabins was not unheard of. Yet few had ever seen one go so far as to climb directly onto a roof and tear through the boards. Many agreed that the strong smell of drying fish had likely drawn the animal in close, and its determination to reach the source had made the encounter more dangerous than usual. In the weeks that followed, Nathaniel rebuilt what he could. He patched the roof with fresh boards, moved his racks of fish farther away from the walls, and stored supplies in tighter containers. Though his cabin stood again, the scars remained as a warning. The gouges in the walls and the collapsed roof beams served as reminders that even inside four walls, there was no guarantee of safety in bear country. For Nathaniel, the experience changed how he lived in the wilderness. Each night he checked and rechecked his surroundings, no longer trusting the thin barrier of old wood against the strength of a predator. He continued to hunt and prepare for the long winters, but he carried with him the knowledge that survival sometimes depended on a single moment, a single shot, and the fortune of hearing dawn break after a night filled with claws above his head. November 2019 in Germany's Black Forest brought cold winds sweeping across the rolling hills and thick fir trees. The Schwarzwald, as locals called it, was a place of legends, but for hunters it was a land of tradition where driven hunts for wild boar had been practiced for generations. In the village of Treburg, a group of seasoned hunters gathered at dawn, each carrying a 12-gauge shotgun loaded with Brennecke slugs. They took up positions along the forest edges, spread across posts marked out for the hunt. Deep within the woods, beaters prepared to drive the animals forward. Their shouts and the crack of sticks meant to flush the boar into the open. Among those waiting was Heinrich Bauer, a 46-year-old farmer who had spent his life working the land and hunting in the Schwarzwald. He was known for his steady aim and his respect for the animals he pursued. The hunt was not only a tradition for him, but also a responsibility, for wild boar numbers had risen sharply in recent years, causing damage to fields and crops. Alongside him stood his longtime friend Karl Dietz, 41, a local carpenter who joined hunts as much for the camaraderie as for the challenge. Both men had hunted side by side many times, but neither could have predicted the chaos that this morning would bring. The forest floor was thick with damp leaves, and the heavy silence before the drive felt tense. Heinrich shifted his weight, scanning the trees ahead, the barrel of his shotgun resting against his arm. The first sounds of beaters echoed faintly in the distance, a mix of voices and breaking branches, signaling that the hunt was underway. Birds lifted from the canopy, startled into the gray November sky. For minutes nothing stirred, then the undergrowth erupted with sudden violence. A massive keeler burst from cover, its tusks gleaming as it charged into the open. Foam flecked its muzzle, and its bristled hide rippled with muscle. Instead of fleeing the noise, it turned and stormed directly toward the line of hunters. Heinrich's heart pounded as one man fired too early, the slug grazing the boar's shoulder without slowing its speed. The shot only fueled its fury. The beast barreled forward with terrifying power. In seconds, it closed the gap, striking the hunter who had fired. The man was thrown into the mud, his ribs snapping under the crushing impact of tusks and bulk. Cries rang out across the line as the others struggled to steady their aim against the moving mass. Heinrich dropped to one knee, waiting for a clean angle as the animal loomed only meters away, its charge unbroken and its rage undimmed. The wounded man lay in the mud, gasping as the massive Kyler towered above him. Its tusks glistened with blood and saliva, the animal's bulk pinning him down as it pressed forward in wild fury. The ground shook under its weight, and its squeals cut through the dense fir trees like a warning to everything in earshot. Other hunters raised their weapons but hesitated, the risk of striking their fallen companion too great. The moment stretched, a blur of noise and fear, until Heinrich steadied his breath and dropped lower into the muck, leveling his shotgun carefully. At less than 5 meters, he pulled the trigger. The Brennecke slug tore through the air and struck with devastating force. The skull of the boar jerked sharply and the beast stumbled. For an instant it staggered forward, then collapsed heavily onto the man beneath, its body twitching with final spasms. The sheer weight of the animal pressed the hunter deeper into the mud, trapping him under a bristled wall of flesh. The line of hunters broke into motion. Karl and 2 others rushed forward, dropping their guns to grab at the boar's legs and heave it away. The effort took every ounce of their strength, the carcass resisting with its size and soaked hide. Slowly they rolled it aside, revealing their companion crushed and groaning, his ribs broken and shoulder torn from the violent strike. He lay pale and weak but alive. Blood stained his parka and mud streaked across his face. But his eyes flickered open as the others knelt beside him. Relief swept through the group, but the weight of what had just happened settled just as quickly. The chaos of the moment left the forest silent again, only the ragged breathing of the men and the faint call of birds disturbed by the noise. The downed hunter was carried to a wagon at the edge of the clearing, where he was rushed back toward the village for treatment. Every jolt of the rough path sent pain shooting through his body, yet he clung to consciousness, his mind still caught in the memory of tusks flashing toward him. In the following weeks he healed slowly, his ribs knitting back together, though his arm never regained full strength. The scars on his shoulder and the stiffness in his chest served as constant reminders of the November morning when a hunt had turned into a battle for survival. Yet he survived, and for him that was reason enough to remain grateful. When he returned to his farmhouse, he took the tusks of the fallen Keeler and mounted them on the wall. They were not displayed as a trophy of conquest, but as a lesson etched in ivory. He told friends and family that the experience proved wild boar were no simple game animal. Their ferocity matched their size, and when cornered they did not run. They fought with fury that could match any predator of the deep woods. For the community, the story became a caution shared with newcomers. Guides warned hunters that each season brought risk, that even the thickest slug might not stop a charging Keeler in time. Children grew up hearing how one November morning the forest itself seemed to rise against the men who entered it. The Black Forest kept its reputation as a place where beauty and danger lived side by side. Every autumn after, when Heinrich and Karl joined the hunts again, they looked to the shadows of the fir trees with greater respect. They remembered the weight of the animal crashing through the line and the sound of bones breaking under its charge. They carried those memories not as fear but as knowledge, shaping their choices with caution and humility. The mounted tusks remained in the farmhouse, silent and sharp, a reminder to all who saw them that survival in the Schwarzwald often came down to a single breath, a steady hand, and the thin space between hunter and hunted. August 2024 in the Alaskan backcountry was warm by northern standards, the days long and filled with the hum of insects over salmon streams. It was here that 37-year-old Marcus Hale set his camp along a narrow creek far from any road or cabin. Marcus was a seasoned outdoorsman from Fairbanks who balanced his life between seasonal work in construction and long trips into the wilderness. Since his youth, he had been drawn to the vast stretches of Alaska, where the land tested skill and endurance. For him, solitude was not loneliness but freedom, and each hunt was a way to provide for himself while reconnecting with the harsh beauty of the land. The creek where Marcus pitched his tent was lined with alder thickets and spruce, the banks slick with mud where salmon pushed upstream. He had chosen the spot for its clear water and the easy access to fishing, stacking his catch nearby with other supplies. His boots were still caked in mud from the morning's work when he returned to rest inside his tent. The canvas shelter was small but sturdy, a familiar space where he stored his pack and gear. His rifle, a trusted companion on every trip, leaned against a tree only a few steps away. Marcus stretched on his sleeping mat, drifting into a light nap as the sun filtered through the trees. The quiet was deceptive, masking the presence of another hunter moving silently nearby. A massive Kodiak sow, powerful and restless, had caught the scent of the stored meat. Driven by hunger, it pushed through the underbrush, circling closer to the tent with slow, deliberate steps. The sounds of the creek and the heavy stillness of the afternoon covered its approach. Without warning, the calm was shattered. Claws ripped through the canvas wall, tearing fabric in long strips as the tent collapsed inwards. Marcus was jolted awake, thrown into confusion as the structure caved over him. Before he could gather himself, the bear's weight pressed down and sharp claws hooked into his shoulder and leg. The strength of the animal was overwhelming as it dragged him bodily from the torn shelter, hauling him across the mud toward the dense thickets. Pain seared through his body as he kicked wildly, his boots striking at the air. He clawed at the ground, at the thick muzzle above him, desperate to slow its pull. The sow's breath was hot, its growls rumbling as it jerked him farther from the ruined tent. Adrenaline surged in Marcus's veins, his mind racing for escape even as he felt the earth slide beneath him. Ahead loomed the alder cover where the bear intended to carry him, a place where the shadows thickened and survival seemed to vanish with each dragged step. The sow pulled Marcus toward the alder wall with relentless force, its claws locked into flesh and fabric. His boots carved deep marks in the mud as he fought back with every ounce of strength left in him. He twisted and kicked, his heel striking the animal's face, buying him only the smallest pause. In that instant, he saw the rifle knocked to the ground when the tent collapsed, its barrel glinting faintly through the dirt and torn canvas. With desperation fueling him, Marcus stretched one arm, dragging himself across the mud while the bear shook him like prey. His fingers brushed the cold steel, then closed tight around the weapon. The sow reared, pulling again, but Marcus jammed the muzzle against its flank. The recoil thundered through his chest as the .45 slug tore into the beast. A shocked roar filled the clearing, the animal's body jerking violently as the bullet struck spine. The grip loosened, and Marcus rolled free, tumbling onto his side, blood streaking his shirt and boots shredded by claws. The sow staggered, snarling, its massive frame shuddering with pain. It snapped its jaws once more, eyes fixed on him, before retreating with surprising speed into the cover of the brush. The thicket swallowed it whole, leaving behind only broken branches, blood, and silence heavy as stone. Marcus lay gasping in the mud, shoulder torn open and leg bleeding badly. He forced himself upright, dragging his injured body back toward what remained of the tent. The canvas lay collapsed, poles snapped, fish racks scattered and ruined. Lantern glass glittered in the dirt and gear was shredded beyond recognition. Smoke from spilled oil lingered in the still air. The once orderly camp was nothing more than wreckage carved by claws and fear. Hours passed before Marcus could move steadily. He bound his wounds with strips of cloth and leaned on his rifle as a crutch. Through the night he kept watch, expecting the sow to return at any moment. The darkness pressed close, each sound in the forest amplified by his battered nerves. But the bear never came back. At dawn he set out, limping along the creek, every step a battle against pain and exhaustion. The hike to safety was slow and punishing, but he refused to stop. By the second day he reached a ranger station, collapsing before he could speak. Rescue crews rushed him to treatment, where doctors cleaned the deep gouges and stitched torn flesh. The bullet wound had crippled the animal, saving Marcus's life at the very edge of death. When he recovered weeks later, the story spread quickly. Locals shook their heads, remarking that tents were no barrier against Kodiak's strength. The event was retold not as a tale of hunting triumph, but as a warning. Marcus himself admitted that courage and reflex were his only shields that day. His body carried scars as sharp reminders, and his mind bore the memory of claws dragging him from the safety of canvas into the teeth of the wild. March 2021 settled cold and hard over the frozen edges near Resolute Bay in Nunavut. Winds cut across the ice fields at -30 degrees, and the hunters who rode out that morning were wrapped in thick layers, faces hidden behind scarves, gloves stiff with frost. Among them was 52-year-old Peter Ikaluk, a respected elder known for his skill and patience, who had hunted seals across the floes since his youth. Alongside him rode his nephew Adam, only 23, eager but less experienced, his snowmobile weaving in and out of the pressure ridges with bursts of speed. They were joined by 3 others from the community, each carrying rifles slung across their backs, ready for the hunt but cautious of the dangers that shadowed every outing in the Arctic. The floes beneath them groaned as they shifted with the currents. Thin cracks spidered across the surface, forcing the hunters to steer carefully as they searched for seals near breathing holes. Their dogs, tied to sleds, moved restlessly, ears flicking and noses lifted to the sharp air. For hours the group advanced slowly across the ice, the silence broken only by the hum of snowmobiles and the distant snap of shifting ridges. It was the dogs that sensed the threat first. Their barking echoed across the frozen plain, sharp and urgent. At first, the men thought it might be a fox or perhaps another hunter approaching, but then they saw it. Against the ridges of snow, a ghostly white shadow paced them. The outline of a polar bear, gaunt and starved, emerged from the distance, its head low, eyes locked on the movement of men and dogs. The hunters tightened their grip on their rifles, but the bear moved with terrifying speed. Despite the cracks and fissures, it leapt effortlessly, covering ground faster than they expected. Hunger drove it forward, each bound bringing it closer. Steam rose from its body in the frigid air, the sound of its paws striking the ice loud against the silence. Peter raised his rifle first, but the mechanism froze in the bitter cold, the metal jammed by frost. Another hunter fumbled with his cartridges, his fingers too numb to load properly through heavy gloves. Panic spread as the bear closed in, its massive form crashing over pressure ridges, sending shards of ice tumbling. Adam, heart pounding, reached for the flare pistol at his side. With no time to think, he raised it and fired. The round burst against the animal's fur, sparks lighting its coat briefly in the gray light. The bear reared back in confusion, the burning flash halting its charge. The moment was brief, but it was enough to shift the balance, the hunters' lives hanging in that frozen pause. The burning flash sent the polar bear twisting upward, its head swinging side to side as smoke and sparks faded into the icy air. Its massive paws slapped against the floe, claws scraping as it staggered for a breath. That pause gave the hunters their only chance. One man dropped to a knee, bracing against the shifting ground, and squeezed the trigger of his rifle. The crack echoed through the frozen silence, the slug striking deep into the chest. The bear jerked, steam rising from its body in the cold as blood spread dark across white fur. It groaned, then collapsed heavily onto the ice. The hunters stood frozen in place, their breaths loud in the stillness, snowmobiles idling softly behind them. The dogs barked frantically, pulling at their harnesses, but the threat was gone. The carcass twitched once, then lay still, its massive frame already frosting over in the bitter wind. A deep crack split the silence as the ice beneath shifted under the weight, warning them that danger came not only from the animal but from the unstable flows beneath their boots. They hurried to drag the body away from the weakest ridges, working together with ropes and sleds. Each tug echoed in their arms, their muscles straining as they pulled the heavy predator to firmer ice. The youngest among them, Adam, felt his legs shake, not from cold but from the fading rush of fear. He had acted without thought, his flare the only reason the bear had faltered long enough for a bullet to land. Peter placed a hand on his nephew's shoulder, steady and firm, a silent acknowledgement that courage sometimes appeared in the smallest of gestures. The men knew the bear had been starving, its ribs sharp beneath the hide, its gaunt shape a reflection of late freeze-up and scarce prey. Survival had pushed it into recklessness, forcing it to face armed hunters on shifting ground. By evening, they turned their snowmobiles back toward the village, the sleds heavy with supplies and the weight of the fallen predator. The ride back was long and cold, the Arctic winds battering them as the sky dimmed to pale pink. Each man carried with him the memory of how close the hunt had come to disaster and how easily rifles, tools, and even steady hands could fail in the grip of frost and hunger. In the days that followed, the tale spread quickly through Resolute Bay. Elders reminded younger hunters that in the north, survival depended as much on instinct as on preparation. Rifles could jam, cartridges could slip, and ice could crack beneath the weight of man or beast. The story of the flare fired into white fur became part of that warning, a reminder that chance and courage often decided life or death. On the ice, the scars of the struggle soon vanished under drifting snow, but the lesson remained. In the Arctic, hunger, cold, and thin ice were always waiting, and sometimes it took only one heartbeat of hesitation to decide who walked away.